The windshield of the sleek black car was covered with raindrops that streamed down in restless patterns. Inside, the silence was heavier than the storm outside, broken only by the low hum of the engine. Amelia sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to hold herself together as her only son, Daniel, drove with a hardened expression she barely recognized. He was once her sweet boy who used to hold her hand crossing the street, the same boy who cried when he scraped his knee. Now, at 35, he looked at her like a rival instead of his mother. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. They had just returned from visiting her late husband Edward's grave. For years, Amelia had carried this ritual with Daniel, honoring Edward's memory with flowers and silence. It was supposed to be a sacred moment of shared grief. But instead, like so many times before, it had dissolved into an argument about the company Edward had built, Hawthorne Motors. Daniel had taken over as CEO. But his decisions, his arrogance, his obsession with power had been gnawing away at both the business and their fragile relationship. "You don't respect me, Mother." Daniel's voice finally cut through the heavy patter of rain. It was sharp, cold, and foreign to her ears. "Every time I make a decision, you undermine me in front of the board." Amelia kept her tone steady even as a knot twisted in her stomach. "Daniel, I only ask questions because I see things you refuse to see. The company was built on trust, on loyalty. Edward didn't sacrifice his life just for you to gamble it away." His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel, the leather squeaking beneath his grip. "That's the problem. You still think this company belongs to Dad. It's mine now. Times have changed. Your ideas are outdated." In the back seat, Daniel's constant shadow, a polished man named Victor Cole, sat quietly. He was the new CFO, always beside Daniel like a whispering devil no one else could hear. His face wore that same subtle smile Amelia had noticed the first day she met him, the kind of smile that revealed nothing but promised danger. She had never trusted him. Something in his eyes reminded her of a predator circling wounded prey. Suddenly, the car swerved off the highway, tires splashing muddy water as they skidded onto the shoulder. Amelia's body jolted with the movement. Her heart sank when she realized they were surrounded by nothing but endless forest, the gray sky pouring down without mercy. "Daniel, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight. The car came to a stop, engine idling. Daniel's jaw clenched as he reached across the console and unlocked her door. He didn't even look at her. "Get out." Her breath caught. "What?" "You heard me," he said flatly. "Get out. Maybe some time alone will help you realize you can't control everything anymore. Maybe you'll finally learn to respect me." For a moment, Amelia couldn't process what he was saying. The storm outside roared, but the coldness in her son's words pierced her more deeply than the rain ever could. She looked at him, searching for any trace of the boy she once knew, but all she saw was a man lost to pride and to Victor's influence. "Daniel, it's pouring." "We're miles from anywhere," she whispered, her voice trembling. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "Then I guess you'd better start walking." "Daniel, please." "Out," he snapped, his eyes flashing with anger that chilled her to the bone. Amelia realized that if she argued, it would only fuel his rage. Slowly, with the dignity of a woman who refused to beg, she reached for her purse, unbuckled her seatbelt, and opened the door. The rain slapped against her immediately, soaking through her thin jacket. She stepped out onto the muddy shoulder, her shoes sinking slightly into the wet ground. As she stood there, shivering but upright, she leaned down one last time and whispered through the open window, "You'll regret this, Daniel." Not as a threat, just as truth. Her son's response was to slam his foot on the gas. The car sped forward, spraying her with dirty water as the taillights disappeared into the storm. Amelia stood motionless, her hair plastered to her face, rain dripping down her cheeks until it blended with her silent tears. She had endured storms before, real ones, financial ones, even the storm of losing her husband. But this betrayal cut deeper than all. Her son, her only child, had just left her abandoned in the middle of nowhere without a second thought. She slowly turned, scanning the deserted road stretching into nothingness on both sides. There was no signal on her phone, no cars passing, just the steady rhythm of rain against the canopy above. She walked to the shelter of a large pine tree nearby, standing beneath its branches where the drops fell slightly less harsh. She wasn't afraid of the isolation, nor the darkness that would soon come. What terrified her was the truth settling in her chest. Her son was no longer the man she had raised. 10 long minutes dragged by, each second heavier than the last. Then, faintly, she heard the rumble of a vehicle. Not the refined hum of Daniel's luxury car, but something deeper, heavier. A black pickup truck slowed as it approached, wipers slapping frantically against the storm. The passenger window rolled down, and a familiar, weathered face appeared. "Need a ride, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Amelia's breath caught. Standing there, looking at her as though this meeting had been destined, was James Rourke, a man she hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. He had once been Edward's closest ally, a former military officer turned head of security for their company. "James," she said, suspicion flickering through her relief. "What are you doing here?" He gave a faint smile. "Let's get you out of this rain first. Then we'll talk." Amelia climbed into the cab of the pickup, her body trembling as the warmth of the heater washed over her. The storm outside kept hammering, but inside, she finally felt her lungs release the breath she had been holding. James handed her a folded towel from the seat beside him. "Dry off as best you can," he said gently, his voice calm but firm, the same way she remembered it years ago when he used to guard Edward's office late into the night. She pressed the towel to her face, wiping away both the rain and the tears that refused to stop. Her hands shook, not from the cold anymore, but from the heartbreak of what had just happened. Her son, her Daniel, had left her like a stranger he no longer owed anything to. "This isn't a coincidence," she whispered, clutching the damp towel. "You didn't just happen to be driving down this road in the middle of a storm." "No, ma'am," James admitted, his eyes fixed on the road as he pulled the truck back onto the highway. The headlights cut through the rain, revealing endless gray stretches of asphalt. "Edward asked me to keep an eye on you. Said there might come a day when you'd need someone in your corner." Her throat tightened. "Edward's been gone 3 years, James. 3 years." She turned to look at him, her face pale, her silver-streaked hair plastered to her cheeks. "Have you been watching me all this time?" "Not constantly," James replied, his tone even. "But enough to know what's been happening at Hawthorne Motors. Enough to know that your son isn't the same man he once was. And enough to know that Victor Cole is not who he pretends to be." The mention of Victor's name made her shiver, though the cab was warm. She had suspected it all along, hadn't she? The way Victor had inserted himself so smoothly into Daniel's life. The way his polished charm concealed something sharper underneath. "What do you know about him?" she asked quietly. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, placing it in her trembling hand. "Everything. Edward started this before he passed. He noticed the money disappearing, the debts piling up, the desperate moves Daniel was making. He asked me to dig, to follow the trail." Her chest ached as she stared at the tiny object in her palm, the weight of it far heavier than its size. "Why didn't Edward tell me?" "He wanted to," James said softly, "but his health was already failing. He didn't want to burden you with suspicions he hadn't fully proved. He wanted facts. By the time he had most of them, his heart gave out." Amelia's vision blurred, not just from the storm outside, but from the tears clouding her eyes again. Edward had known. He had carried this weight in silence to protect her, and now she held in her hand the very proof of what her heart had feared. She whispered almost to herself, "My son has been gambling, hasn't he? That's why the company's finances feel so fragile. That's why he's become so cruel." James nodded, his weathered profile illuminated by the glow of the dashboard. "Poker, sports betting, risky trades. He's lost millions. And when the banks wouldn't loan him more, he turned to men you don't ever want to owe. Dangerous men. And Victor? Victor has a pattern. He finds men like Daniel, men drowning in debt and pride. He offers them a way out, but slowly takes everything for himself. He's done it before with other companies. Once he has control, he bleeds them dry and walks away with no trace. Amelia's fingers tightened around the USB. Every word felt like a knife twisting deeper, not only because of what Victor was doing, but because Daniel had let him. My Daniel, she whispered brokenly, the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, who begged his father to teach him how to fix cars. How did he become this man who left me on the side of a road? James kept his eyes on the storm, but his voice softened. Grief changes people. Power corrupts. And Victor knows how to exploit weakness. But don't mistake me. Amelia, Daniel made choices. He let himself be used. Her tears finally stopped, not because the pain lessened, but because something else was rising inside her. Something steady, something sharp. She sat straighter, her wet jacket clinging to her but no longer making her shiver. Daniel thinks he taught me a lesson tonight, she said, her voice quiet but hardening like steel. But he has no idea who he's dealing with. James glanced at her for the first time, and for a fleeting second, a faint smile tugged at his lips. He had heard that tone before years ago when Amelia and Edward had worked side by side, not just as business partners, but as strategists in a different kind of battle. What's our next move? He asked, as if falling naturally into an old chain of command. Amelia looked out at the rain-forest, her reflection staring back from the glass. It wasn't the face of a broken mother anymore. It was the face of a woman who had spent her life surviving storms, building empires, burying her husband, and now being betrayed by her son. Take me home, she said firmly. I need to change into dry clothes. Then we're going to Edward's study. He always had contingencies. There are documents, records, things Daniel knows nothing about. The truck rumbled forward through the storm. Outside, the rain poured on mercilessly. But inside, Amelia felt something she hadn't felt in years. A dangerous kind of calm. The kind of clarity that comes right before action. Daniel thought he had abandoned a helpless old woman. What he had really done was awaken someone he no longer remembered, someone who had been waiting quietly, biding her time. And now it was time to remind him. The storm hadn't slowed when James's truck finally turned onto the long driveway of Amelia's estate. The headlights caught the stone pillars at the entrance, the ones Edward had insisted on building 25 years ago as a symbol of permanence. Tonight, they looked less like symbols of strength and more like sentinels guarding a house filled with memories and secrets. The truck rolled to a stop, and Amelia sat for a moment, her hand still clutching the USB as if it were the last lifeline to Edward's wisdom. The rain tapped harder against the windshield, urging her to move. James didn't say a word, simply waited, the way a soldier waits for a commander's orders. Finally, Amelia exhaled and opened the door. The rain hit her again, but this time she didn't flinch. She walked steadily up the steps, each footstep heavier with the weight of what she carried. Not just the soaked fabric of her jacket, but the knowledge of her son's betrayal. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and faint perfume, a mixture of warmth and loneliness. It was the same house where Daniel had taken his first steps, where Edward had paced during late-night strategy sessions, where birthdays and holidays had once filled the air with laughter. Tonight, it was silent except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. James followed her in, closing the door firmly behind them. He stood respectfully at a distance as Amelia shed her wet jacket and shoes. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the wall, steadying herself. 3 years, she murmured. 3 years since Edward left, and I thought I'd seen the worst life could throw at me. James spoke carefully, almost hesitant. Sometimes the deepest wounds come not from enemies, but from the people we love the most. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to insist Daniel wasn't lost completely, but the memory of his face when he told her to get out of the car, hard, unyielding, almost cruel, flashed in her mind. That image silenced her. I need to see Edward's study, she said quietly. Now. They walked down the long hallway to the back of the house where the study had remained untouched since Edward's death. Amelia had refused to let anyone change a single thing. Not the bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, not the globe in the corner, not even the pen still resting in the mahogany desk's groove. For years it had been a shrine, a sanctuary she entered only when she needed to feel close to him. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. She pushed the door open. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the room. Her hand hovered over the light switch before she decided against it. Instead, she lit the small brass lamp on the desk, its warm glow spilling across the room like a memory resurrected. James stepped in behind her, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of someone who had once analyzed battlefields. Edward kept everything organized, he observed. Organized, Amelia echoed, her fingers brushing the edge of the desk. But he also kept things hidden. Her movements were steady now, deliberate. She walked to the antique globe in the corner, the one Daniel had always thought was just decoration. She bent down and pressed a small latch hidden beneath its wooden base. The globe clicked softly, and a keypad slid out. James raised his brows but said nothing as she typed in 6 digits, her wedding anniversary. Then she hesitated, adding a second sequence, coordinates. The place where she and Edward had first met, back when both of them were still young and reckless, chasing missions that could have ended them both. The globe unlocked with a faint hiss, its base sliding open to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger and a sealed envelope with her name written in Edward's handwriting. Amelia froze, her breath catching. Her husband's handwriting, so familiar yet so painfully absent from her life these past years, stared back at her. Her fingers trembled as she reached in and pulled them out, laying them on the desk with reverence. James watched silently. He knew better than to speak in moments like this. Amelia opened the ledger first. Edward's precise script filled the pages, notes, observations, dates. She read slowly, her lips moving with the words, her expression hardening with every line. 5 years ago, she whispered. He saw it. He saw Daniel changing before I did. The gambling, the debts, even Victor's arrival. Her eyes darted across the lines. He wrote everything. James stepped closer, pointing to his section. Look here. He tracked Victor's previous targets. The pattern is the same. Find a vulnerable executive, offer to rescue them, then take everything. He did it in Chicago, in Atlanta, and now here. Her stomach churned, and Daniel walked right into it. Amelia set the ledger down and picked up the envelope. The seal cracked softly as she broke it open. Inside was a letter and several legal documents. She unfolded the letter first, her eyes stinging as Edward's voice seemed to echo in her head with every word. My dearest Amelia, if you're reading this, then I am gone. And if you are here, it means you are facing the storm I feared most, our son's downfall. I prayed I was wrong, but my instincts rarely were. Daniel has weaknesses he does not admit, and men like Victor know how to turn weakness into ruin. I've prepared safeguards, not only for the company, but for you. Trust James as you once trusted me. Use what I've left behind, not to destroy our son, but to remind him of the consequences of his choices. Sometimes love means letting someone fall. Be strong, my love. Robert. Her hands shook as she lowered the paper, pressing it to her chest. The tears came again, but these were different. Not just grief, but fury, resolve, and an aching love for the man who had foreseen it all. James's voice broke the silence. He trusted you to finish what he started. Amelia straightened, her tears drying on her cheeks. Daniel thinks he stripped me of power tonight. He has no idea his father left me holding all of it. She looked around the study, once a tomb of memories, now an armory of truths. For the first time since Edward's death, Amelia felt alive with purpose. The woman her son had abandoned in the rain wasn't broken. She was preparing for war. The letter lay open on the desk, its words echoing in Amelia's mind long after she had finished reading. Edward's handwriting, steady and deliberate, carried more weight than anything Daniel had said to her in months. She traced her finger over the lines, almost as if touching the paper could bring her husband back. For a fleeting moment, she could hear his voice, firm yet gentle, reminding her that preparation was survival, that strength came not from power, but from clarity. Her hands trembled not from weakness, but from the storm of emotions colliding inside her. Daniel's cruelty, Edward's foresight, her own guilt for not seeing the signs sooner. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her breath. James stood quietly across the room, giving her space but watching closely. He had seen this look before, Years ago, in deserts and jungles, when leaders realized they were stepping into battles they could not avoid. Finally, Amelia looked up. Edward always knew, she said softly. He saw Daniel slipping long before I admitted it. And I made excuses. I told myself it was grief or the pressure of leadership. I let him sink deeper because I couldn't face the truth. Don't do that to yourself, James replied, his voice low but steady. You gave him time because you loved him. That's not weakness. That's being a mother. She shook her head, bitter laughter escaping her lips. And what has that love earned me? Being thrown onto the side of a road like a stranger. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she pressed her hand against her mouth, holding back the sob that threatened to break through. James took a careful step closer. He may have abandoned you, Amelia, but Edward didn't. And I won't either. You're not alone in this. The words grounded her. She wiped her eyes, then folded the letter carefully, placing it back in its envelope, as if it were a sacred relic. Her gaze shifted to the legal documents Edward had included. The paper was dense with signatures, seals, and careful amendments. What are these? She asked, her fingers running over the embossed notary stamps. Safeguards, James answered. Edward restructured Hawthorne Motors before his health declined. On the surface, Daniel may look like he holds full control, but Edward made sure the real power remained with you. Through holding companies, trusts, hidden provisions. Amelia looked at him sharply. So all this time, Daniel thought he was the king, and in reality he was a child playing with pieces of paper he didn't understand. A faint, almost reluctant smile tugged at James's mouth. That's one way of putting it. Edward knew this day might come. He wanted to give Daniel the chance to rise, but he also prepared for his fall. And he trusted you to know when to act. Amelia turned back to the desk, her eyes burning with a new fire. Daniel wanted to teach me a lesson tonight. But the truth is, he has no idea who his mother really is. He sees an old woman clinging to memories. He forgets what I was before Edward and I built this company. He forgets what I'm still capable of. James's gaze lingered on her. For a moment, he wasn't looking at the grieving widow he had watched these last 3 years. He was looking at the woman who had once outthought dangerous men, who had learned to anticipate threats before they appeared. Edward had trusted her for a reason. Amelia pulled her hair back, tying it into a neat knot. She looked different already, less fragile, more resolved. The storm outside kept pounding against the windows, but the storm inside her had settled into something sharper, something controlled. What now? James asked quietly. She straightened, her hand resting on the back of Edward's chair. Now we verify everything. Every debt Daniel has hidden, every deal Victor has arranged. We identify allies inside the company, people who still care about integrity, not greed. And then we wait for the right moment. James nodded. I still have access to old systems, security clearances. I can trace what Daniel and Victor have been hiding. Good, Amelia replied firmly. Start tonight, but be discreet. If Victor suspects even for a second that I'm not broken, he'll strike sooner. James's voice dropped, protective. And what about Daniel? For a long moment, Amelia didn't answer. She moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked grounds where her son had once played as a boy. She remembered his laughter echoing through the trees, the way he used to run up the steps breathless, begging his father to show him something new in the garage. Her throat tightened. He's still my son, she whispered. As much as I want to hate him, I can't. But I can't protect him from the consequences either. He chose this path. James stepped closer, his voice steady but not unkind. Then maybe the lesson isn't yours to learn. Maybe it's his. Amelia turned back, her eyes glistening but fierce. Then let's make sure when he learns it, it's a lesson he never forgets. The grandfather clock chimed in the hallway, the sound deep and steady, as if marking the beginning of something irreversible. Amelia gathered Edward's documents and secured them in the hidden compartment again. She locked the globe, restoring it to its innocent disguise. Then she turned to James, her voice calm and commanding. Tomorrow we start. Tonight I rest. Because the war for my family and for Edward's legacy begins at dawn. James inclined his head in silent agreement. He had followed Edward once, through missions and shadows. Now, without hesitation, he would follow Amelia. As she left the study, Amelia cast one last look at the empty chair. For 3 years it had been a monument to loss. Tonight, it became a throne waiting to be reclaimed. The morning came gray and heavy, as though the storm of the previous night had not truly ended, but only shifted into a quieter form. The sky hung low, swollen with clouds that threatened more rain. Amelia stood by her bedroom window, a porcelain teacup cradled in her hands, though the tea inside had long since grown cold. She wasn't drinking it. She was only holding it to give her trembling fingers something to do. Down below, the estate ground stretched wide and silent. She could almost see a ghost of the past. Edward walking beside a much younger Daniel, showing him how to plant a tree, how to hold a hammer, how to take pride in small tasks. Amelia blinked, and the image vanished, leaving only an empty lawn. The emptiness stabbed at her, but she refused to let the pain consume her. Not anymore. The sound of a car door outside broke her thoughts. She looked down and saw James, already in place, his truck parked discreetly by the side gate. He was punctual as always, a soldier who treated every assignment as a mission, every promise as an oath. She set down the teacup, adjusted her shawl, and descended the stairs. The house felt colder than usual, as if it too had sensed the betrayal that had occurred. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound carrying through the still halls. She paused at Edward's portrait near the staircase landing. His painted eyes seemed to look right at her, calm yet commanding. "Edward," she whispered under her breath, "I hope I'm strong enough for this." She reached the study where James was already waiting, his laptop open, a mess of wires and encrypted drives spread across Edward's desk. He had set up like a man preparing for battle. Only his weapons were lines of code and data. "Morning, ma'am," he greeted without looking up, his eyes scanning the lines of information flooding his screen. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady though her heart felt anything but. She walked closer, placing her hand on the back of Edward's chair, but not sitting in it. Not yet. It still felt sacred, as though she needed to earn the right to occupy it. James tapped a few keys, then leaned back slightly. "I've traced Daniel's accounts. You were right. He's deeper than even Edward suspected. Multiple offshore holdings, debts disguised as investments. And Victor's fingerprints are all over them." Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. "How deep?" James hesitated. "Millions. Enough to sink the company if the wrong people call in their debts. Worse, I found transfers, small at first, then larger, to shell companies tied back to Victor. Your son isn't just in debt to him, Amelia. He's practically given him the keys." Amelia felt her stomach twist. So Victor doesn't just own Daniel's loyalty. He owns his fear. "Exactly," James confirmed. He turned the laptop toward her, showing her spreadsheets filled with numbers, account codes, and hidden trails of money. Victor set the trap, but Daniel walked straight into it. For a long moment, Amelia just stared at the screen. It wasn't the numbers that broke her, it was the realization behind them. Each transfer wasn't just money lost. It was another step her son had taken away from her, away from the values Edward had built, away from the boy she remembered. Her voice cracked slightly. "Why? Daniel, why would you do this?" James closed the laptop gently, as though sensing the weight of her breaking heart. "Because pride blinds men, Amelia. And because Victor knew how to use that pride against him." She turned to James suddenly, her eyes wet but fierce. "Then I won't let Victor win. I won't let him take what Edward built, what we sacrificed everything for. Daniel may be lost, but Hawthorne Motors won't be." James nodded. "Then we'll need allies. People who believe in you, not in Daniel or Victor. Do you trust anyone on the board?" Amelia hesitated. Faces flashed through her mind. Men and women who had once dined in this very house, who had toasted Edward's leadership, who had praised Daniel's charm in his early years. But time and money had a way of twisting loyalties. "Margaret," she said finally. "Margaret Ellis. She was Edward's longest-serving board member. She always respected me. And she loved this company, truly loved it, not just for the dividends." "Good," James said. "We'll start with her. But carefully. If word gets out that you're moving against Daniel and Victor, they'll tighten their grip. Amelia lowered herself slowly into Edward's chair at last. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to sit there, not as a grieving widow, but as the woman Edward had trusted to lead if he could not. The leather creaked softly beneath her, and something inside her shifted. "This isn't about revenge, James," she said, her tone firm. "It's about survival. For the company. For Edward's legacy. And maybe, just maybe, for Daniel too. If I can pull him back from the edge before Victor destroys him completely." James looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "And if Daniel doesn't want to be saved?" Amelia paused, her hands tightening on the armrests. "Then he'll have to live with the lesson he wanted to teach me. Sometimes a mother's love can't protect you from yourself." The grandfather clock chimed again in the hallway, and Amelia felt as though time itself was reminding her that every moment counted. She rose from the chair, her face calm but determined. "Call Margaret," she instructed. "Set a meeting. Quietly. Somewhere outside the office, where Victor won't expect us." James nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I know just the place." As he dialed, Amelia walked back to the window. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and faint sunlight was breaking through the clouds. The storm hadn't ended, but it had shifted, just like her. Daniel thought he had abandoned her in the rain. What he didn't know was that in doing so, he had awakened the storm inside her. Margaret Ellis sat at the far corner of a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, her back straight, her scarf neatly pinned at her collar. She was a woman of 70, sharp-eyed and sharper-willed, the kind who had survived decades in boardrooms where men thought her presence a courtesy rather than a threat. But Amelia knew better. Margaret was one of the few who valued principle over profit. As Amelia entered, the little bell over the door jingled, and Margaret looked up immediately. Her eyes softened, but there was worry in them too. Amelia walked slowly, her posture dignified, though her heart was pounding as though she were walking into battle. James trailed a step behind, his expression unreadable but his presence grounding her. "Amelia," Margaret greeted, rising slightly from her seat. "It's been too long. Far too long," Amelia replied, embracing her gently. The warmth of that embrace was a reminder that not every bridge had burned. She sat down, folding her hands carefully on the table. They exchanged pleasantries for a moment, old friends catching up, though both knew the meeting carried more weight than the coffee cups in front of them. Finally, Margaret leaned in, her voice low. "You wouldn't have called me here unless it was serious." Amelia met her gaze. "It's worse than serious. Daniel has lost control, and Victor Cole is pulling the strings." Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "I suspected as much. The board whispers. Numbers don't add up. And Daniel, he's not the boy Edward raised anymore." Amelia's heart squeezed at Margaret's bluntness. Hearing the truth out loud always hurt more than suspecting it in silence. "I wanted to believe he was just overwhelmed. That grief had clouded him. But I can't ignore it any longer. He's in debt, Margaret. Dangerous debt. And Victor is preparing to strip the company bare." Margaret was silent for a long moment. She stirred her coffee absently, though Amelia knew her mind was racing. Finally, she set the spoon down with a soft clink. "What are you asking of me?" "I need to know who on the board still believes in Edward's vision," Amelia said. "Who still believes in integrity. If we're going to challenge Daniel and Victor, I can't do it alone." Margaret studied her carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And what of Daniel? He's your son. Do you mean to destroy him?" Amelia's throat tightened. The question cut deep, not because it accused her, but because it forced her to confront the very conflict tearing at her heart. "No," she whispered. "I want to save him. But if he insists on destroying himself, I won't let him take Edward's legacy with him. I can't." Margaret reached across the table, her hand covering Amelia's. It was a rare gesture from a woman known for her steel. "Then you have me. And I suspect you'll have others, too, once the truth comes to light. But you must be careful. Victor has a way of making enemies disappear. Not literally, perhaps, but professionally. He ruins reputations before people even know they're under attack." Amelia nodded slowly. "Then we'll have to be one step ahead of him. Edward always said a war isn't won by strength alone, but by foresight. James, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. I've already gathered proof of Victor's dealings. Once we have enough board members aligned with us, we can corner him. But timing is everything. If we move too early, he'll bury the evidence. If we move too late, the company collapses. Margaret's gaze flicked to James, then back to Amelia. You've chosen your allies well. Edward would have approved. For a brief moment, Amelia felt Edward's presence again, as though his hand rested on her shoulder, steadying her. She sat a little taller, her resolve hardening. Their conversation stretched on, weaving through strategies, names, and potential risks. Margaret promised to reach out discreetly to 2 other board members she trusted, both of whom had grown uneasy with Daniel's reckless leadership. Amelia listened carefully. Every detail another thread in the net she was slowly weaving around Victor. But beneath the strategy, her heart ached. With every word, with every plan, she couldn't escape the image of Daniel's face in the car, his cold voice telling her to get out. Her son had become her adversary, not by her choice, but by his. When the meeting ended, Margaret squeezed Amelia's hand once more. You are stronger than you think, Amelia. Don't let grief blind you to that. You've survived storms before. You'll survive this one, too. Outside, the drizzle had begun again, soft and steady. Amelia pulled her coat tighter around her. But this time the rain didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like a reminder that storms always return, but so does resilience. As James opened the car door for her, Amelia paused, staring at the gray sky. Do you think Daniel can still be saved? She asked quietly. James hesitated, then answered honestly. I think everyone can be saved, Amelia. The question is, does he want to be? She nodded slowly, her heart heavy. Then I'll fight for him as long as I can. But if the choice comes down to my son or Edward's legacy, her voice faltered, then steadied. I'll do what Edward would have wanted. I'll protect the legacy. As the car pulled away from the cafe, Amelia leaned back in her seat, clutching the envelope of Edward's letter in her purse. She had walked into the storm last night broken. Today, she was walking out of it armed. The war had begun, not of her choosing, but of necessity. And Amelia Hawthorne was no longer the woman her son thought he could abandon. The following evening, the Hawthorne estate was quieter than usual, but Amelia couldn't rest. Sleep had become a stranger since that night on the highway. She sat in the dim light of the study, Edward's letter unfolded on the desk before her. Her eyes moved over the familiar handwriting again and again, each word searing into her memory. Sometimes love means letting someone fall. The line struck her like a knife every time. She whispered it aloud now, her voice breaking. But how far, Edward? How far do I let him fall before I reach for him? Her hand shook as she pressed it against her lips. The mother in her wanted to run to Daniel, to shield him, to remind him he was still her child. But the woman Edward had trusted, the woman who now sat in his chair, knew she couldn't. To save him too soon would only feed his arrogance, would only give Victor more time to tighten his grip. James's voice cut through the silence as he entered the study. I've spoken to Margaret again. She confirmed what we suspected. 2 board members are uneasy. One of them, Harold Whitman, already regrets approving Daniel's last risky merger. The other, Catherine Rhodes, is furious about the missing funds. Amelia straightened, wiping her eyes quickly. So the cracks are showing. James nodded, but Victor is aware. He's been moving faster, covering his tracks. He's clever, Amelia, and dangerous. She leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling over her. I know. I can feel him every time Daniel speaks, as if Victor's words are lodged in my son's throat. I've lost Daniel's trust, but I won't lose the company. James placed a small folder on the desk. I've pulled more records. Transfers, phone logs, travel documents. Enough to corner Victor, if we time it right. Amelia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the pages. She froze when she saw Daniel's signature scrawled at the bottom of a contract linking one of the shell companies back to Victor. Her son's name, so familiar, once a source of pride, looked alien to her now, as though he had signed away not just money, but his soul. Her chest ached, and she closed the folder abruptly, unable to look any longer. Every time I see his name on these papers, I feel like I'm reading an obituary. Not for his life, but for the boy he used to be. James's eyes softened. He's still alive, Amelia. Which means there's still a chance. She looked at him bitterly. A chance, yes, but only if he chooses it. Edward was right. Love can't shield him from himself. For a long moment, silence hung heavy between them. The storm outside had faded into a light drizzle, raindrops tapping gently against the window panes like an old lullaby. Amelia closed her eyes, remembering nights when Daniel was small, curled up on the couch beside her, his head resting on her lap as Edward read aloud stories of courage and loyalty. Back then, Daniel had listened wide-eyed, soaking up every word. What had happened to that child? A knock shattered the memory. Amelia stiffened, exchanging a glance with James. Few people came uninvited to her home, especially at night. James moved to the door cautiously, his hand instinctively brushing against the inside of his coat where she suspected he kept a weapon. When he opened the door, Daniel stood there. Amelia's breath caught. Her son, her flesh and blood, stood on her doorstep drenched from the drizzle, his expensive suit wrinkled, his tie loose, his eyes bloodshot. He looked less like the polished CEO he pretended to be and more like a man unraveling. "Mother," he said, his voice hoarse. Her heart leapt and broke all at once. She rose slowly from Edward's chair, her voice trembling. "Daniel." He stepped inside, ignoring James's presence, his eyes fixed only on her. I shouldn't have left you on that road. It was wrong." His words stumbled as though regret and pride were fighting inside him. Amelia's lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to rush forward, to hold him, to tell him she forgave him. But something in his eyes stopped her. Behind the remorse, she saw fear. "Why are you here, Daniel?" she asked carefully. He hesitated, glancing around the study. His gaze lingered on Edward's chair, on the ledger, on the faint glow of the lamp. Finally, he looked back at her, his voice breaking. "I'm in trouble, Mother. Worse than you know. They're threatening me." Amelia's blood ran cold. "Who?" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "The men Victor brought in. If I don't pay them back, I don't know what they'll do." For a moment, Amelia forgot every betrayal, every wound. Instinct surged through her. Protect, shelter, save. But then Edward's letter echoed in her mind again. Sometimes love means letting someone fall. Her throat tightened. "Daniel, how much?" His eyes filled with shame. "More than I can ever repay." The silence that followed was suffocating. Amelia's hands trembled, torn between her son and her duty, between her heart and Edward's wisdom. She wanted to save him with a mother's love, but she knew saving him too easily might destroy him forever. Behind her, James's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "If you want help, Daniel, then you'll have to tell us everything. No lies, no half-truths, everything." Daniel looked at him with a flash of anger. "Who are you to demand that?" Amelia stepped forward, her voice quiet but unyielding. "He's the man your father trusted when he no longer trusted anyone else. And right now, he's the only reason you're still standing here." Daniel's expression wavered, torn between pride and desperation. Finally, he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "Then I'll tell you. But once you know, you'll never forgive me." Amelia's heart clenched. She walked closer, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. "Daniel, I already forgave you. That doesn't mean I'll protect you from the truth." He lifted his head slowly, his eyes hollow. "Then you'd better prepare yourself, Mother, because the truth is uglier than you think." The air in the study grew heavier with every second Daniel sat there, his head bowed, his hands gripping his hair like he was trying to hold himself together. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the silence, each chime sounding louder than the last. Amelia stood near him, torn between wanting to comfort her son and fearing what his words would reveal. James remained by the doorway, arms folded, his watchful eyes never leaving Daniel. He looked less like a guest now and more like a guard, steady and ready for whatever storm was about to break. At last, Daniel lifted his head, his voice cracking as the first words tumbled out. "It started small, Mother. Just a few bets, poker games with friends, some stock trades. I thought I understood. I kept telling myself it was harmless, that I could win back more than I lost. But I never stopped losing. Amelia's chest tightened. His voice was still her son's, but it was raw, stripped of the arrogance he wore in the boardroom. "Daniel," she whispered, her heart aching. "Why didn't you come to me?" His laugh was bitter, almost hollow. "Because you would have looked at me the way you're looking at me now. Like I'm a child who disappointed you." He dragged his hands down his face, his words tumbling faster, as though once he began, he couldn't stop. Then Victor showed up. He told me I wasn't the first to gamble too much. That men like me weren't failures, just risk-takers. He said he could help, that he could make everything disappear. Amelia's stomach sank. She had known Victor was dangerous, but hearing how he had sunk his hooks into Daniel made her skin crawl. "And you believed him?" "I wanted to," Daniel admitted. "I was drowning, Mother. I owed money I didn't have. And Victor, he made it sound easy. He paid off the first debt, just like that. He told me all I had to do was give him a little control over the company. Temporary, he said. A safety net." James's voice cut through, sharp and cold. Temporary is Victor's favorite lie. Daniel flinched, but didn't deny it. After that, it was always more. Bigger bets, bigger risks. He encouraged them. Sometimes I think he even set them up so I'd lose. Every time I sank deeper, he was there with the answer. Another loan, another contract. And every time, I signed away more of the company, more of myself. Amelia pressed her hand against her chest, fighting the sob that threatened to escape. Her son, the boy who had once begged his father to teach him how to change a tire, was unraveling before her eyes. "How much, Daniel?" she asked softly. His eyes lifted to hers, bloodshot and filled with shame. 40 million, maybe more. And the men Victor brought in, he swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "They aren't businessmen, Mother. They don't care about contracts. They said if I don't deliver soon, they'll take it out of me." Amelia's knees almost buckled. She gripped the edge of Edward's desk, her fingers digging into the polished wood. "My God." James's expression hardened. "Names. Who are these men?" Daniel shook his head, panic flashing in his eyes. "I can't. If they find out I spoke." James stepped forward, his voice firm but not loud. "If you don't tell us, Daniel, they'll find you anyway. These men don't forgive. They don't forget. The only chance you have is if we know what we're facing." Amelia reached out, touching her son's hand. Her voice was softer but no less urgent. "Daniel, please. If you ever trusted me at all, trust me now." For a long moment, Daniel sat frozen, torn between fear and desperation. Finally, his shoulders slumped, and he whispered, "They call themselves the Meridians. They're not just debt collectors. They run an entire network. Drugs, weapons, extortion. Victor promised me they'd never come near me, that he'd protect me. But now," his voice cracked, "now, they say I belong to them until every cent is paid." Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. Victor hadn't just taken her son's money. He had delivered him into the hands of predators. Her heart screamed to hold Daniel, to promise she could fix everything. But Edward's words echoed in her head again, louder this time. "Sometimes love means letting someone fall." She tightened her grip on Daniel's hand. "Listen to me. You are my son, and I will never stop loving you. But love doesn't erase choices. You signed those papers. You let Victor lead you into this. I can't undo that. But I can fight for what your father built. For the company. For the people who depend on it. For your soul, if you'll let me." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He shook his head, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve saving." Amelia's tears spilled over as she cupped his face in her trembling hands. "None of us do. But that never stopped me from being your mother." James watched silently, his jaw tight, his gaze shifting between the mother and son. For the first time, he saw Daniel not as the arrogant executive, but as a man stripped bare, frightened, and fragile. The clock chimed again, the sound deep and steady, as though marking the gravity of the moment. Amelia held Daniel's face firmly, her eyes burning into his. "Then listen carefully, Daniel," she said. "If you want redemption, if you want any chance to walk away from this, you'll have to fight with me. Not against me. Not beside Victor. With me. Daniel's breath shuddered, his pride warring with the desperation in his eyes. At last, he gave a small nod. Tell me what to do. Amelia closed her eyes briefly, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. When she opened them again, there was no doubt left. Only resolve. The war wasn't just for Edward's legacy anymore. It was for her son's very life. The night stretched long inside the study, the lamplight casting deep shadows across Edward's desk. Papers lay scattered, contracts, hidden records, Edward's notes, like pieces of a puzzle Amelia was forcing herself to solve before it was too late. Daniel sat slumped in the armchair across from her, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. The rawness of his confession still hung between them, heavy and unshakable. Amelia's hands moved slowly, organizing the documents into neat stacks. She needed order, even if her heart was in chaos. Every time her eyes flicked to her son, she felt the same clash of emotions, love and fury, grief and hope, all tangled together. James stood near the window, his stance rigid, his eyes scanning the dark grounds outside as though expecting danger to appear at any moment. His silence spoke louder than words. He was preparing for the fight already. At last, Amelia broke the silence. Her voice was quiet but steady. We can't outmuscle men like the Meridians, Daniel. Violence won't save you. But truth can. Daniel lifted his head weakly. Truth won't matter to them. They don't care about right or wrong. They care about money. Amelia leaned forward, her eyes sharp. Not them. The board. The shareholders. The people who still believe in Hawthorne Motors. If they see Victor for who he is, if they see the debts, the lies, the theft, then he loses his shield. He can't protect you if his empire collapses beneath him. Daniel swallowed hard. And if Victor realizes what we're doing before then, James finally turned from the window, then he'll move against you. Against all of us. That's why timing is everything. We have to expose him when he least expects it, when he's already standing in the spotlight. Amelia nodded slowly, her mind working. The quarterly shareholder meeting. It's in 2 weeks. Victor will push Daniel forward as his puppet, parade him as the confident leader. That's when we strike. That's when we show everyone the truth. Daniel stiffened. 2 weeks? I don't have 2 weeks. The Meridians gave me 7 days. The room went still. Amelia's hand froze on the desk, her eyes snapping to him. 7 days. Daniel nodded, shame clouding his face. They said if I don't deliver by then, they'll take me apart piece by piece. And they meant it. James muttered a curse under his breath, pacing the room. That changes everything. We don't have the luxury of time. If they move before the meeting, we lose our chance. Amelia pressed her fingers against her temple, the weight of it pressing down on her. Her son's life hung on a countdown she could not ignore. She wanted to scream, to beg Edward for guidance, but she knew what he would say. Clarity over panic. Strength over fear. Her voice steadied as she spoke again. Then we make our own timeline. If we can't wait 2 weeks, we force Victor's hand sooner. If we can corner him into a mistake, into revealing himself, we can cut the Meridians out of the picture before they collect their due. Daniel rubbed his face, despair etched into every line. You don't know them, Mother. They don't make mistakes. They don't forgive. Amelia knelt in front of him suddenly, her hands gripping his knees, her eyes burning with fierce determination. Then listen to me. You are my son, and you will not be destroyed by them. Not while I still breathe. But you must fight with me, Daniel. No more secrets. No more lies. Every detail you've hidden, every deal you've made. I need to know it. His lips trembled as tears filled his eyes again. I don't deserve your fight. Her voice softened, trembling with love and fury at once. You don't have to deserve it. You're my son. That's enough. For the first time since he arrived, Daniel broke. He leaned forward, burying his face against her shoulder like a child again. His sobs shook him, raw and unrestrained, and Amelia held him as tightly as she could, rocking slightly as though he were still the little boy who once cried over a scraped knee. Her tears mixed with his, falling silently into his hair. James turned his eyes away, giving them a fragment of privacy, though the sight tugged at something buried deep in him. He had seen soldiers break like that in war, Men who had carried too much for too long, finally collapsing when someone gave them permission to feel. When Daniel's sobs finally slowed, Amelia brushed his hair back from his damp forehead. You will tell me everything tomorrow. Tonight, you'll sleep here, under this roof where you're safe. Tomorrow we begin. James spoke up again, his voice measured. Amelia, you should know, Victor isn't blind. He'll realize Daniel came here. He'll suspect something. He may even send someone. Amelia rose slowly, her hand still resting protectively on her son's shoulder. Then let him suspect. Let him come. This house has stood through storms before. It will stand through this one too. Her eyes moved to Edward's portrait on the wall. In the lamplight, his painted gaze looked almost alive, almost approving. She squared her shoulders, her heart pounding with both fear and resolve. Edward, she whispered under her breath, you said sometimes love means letting someone fall. But tonight I will be the hand that lifts him up again. And I'll be the shield that protects what you built. The clock chimed midnight. A new day had begun. And with it, Amelia knew the final battle was drawing closer. The storm had lifted by the time dawn broke, but the weight in Amelia's chest hadn't. She sat in Edward's chair once again, her eyes fixed on the documents spread before her. The evidence of Victor's corruption, Daniel's debts, the contracts tying them to the Meridians, it was all there. It felt like staring at the wreckage of a life's work. But wreckage could be rebuilt. James entered quietly, a phone in his hand. Margaret's on board. Harold too. Catherine is hesitant but leaning our way. They'll stand with you when the time comes. Amelia nodded, relief flickering across her tired face. Good. That's enough to fracture Victor's hold. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled, his face drawn. He looked older than his 35 years, as though the burden of his mistakes had aged him overnight. For the first time in years, he didn't walk into the room with arrogance. He walked in humbled, uncertain, even afraid. Mother, he began, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. Last night, I told you more than I've ever admitted to anyone. But you need to know one more thing. Victor won't let me go without a fight. He'll come after me, and he won't care who gets hurt in the process. Amelia rose, crossing the room to stand before him. Her hand touched his cheek gently. Then let him come. Because this time, Daniel, you won't be facing him alone. Later that week, the confrontation came sooner than expected. Victor himself arrived at the estate, his smile as polished as ever, but his eyes sharp, calculating. Two men trailed him, silent and menacing, the kind who didn't need to speak to be threatening. Amelia, Victor greeted smoothly, stepping into the study as if he owned it. Imagine my surprise when Daniel told me he was coming here. Family reconciliation, how touching. But I'm afraid you've involved yourself in matters you don't understand. Amelia didn't flinch. She stood tall, Edward's ledger open on the desk behind her, James at her side like a shadow. On the contrary, Victor, I understand everything. The debts, the shell companies, the manipulation. It ends here. Victor's smile faltered. Ends? Amelia, Daniel owes more than you can possibly cover. And the Meridians don't forgive. You think a widow and her old soldier can stand against them? Daniel spoke then, his voice unsteady but stronger than before. She's not alone, Victor. And I'm done being your puppet. Victor turned, his eyes narrowing at Daniel. For a moment, silence stretched, heavy with danger. Then his polished mask slipped, and his true nature showed, cruel, cold, ruthless. You ungrateful child. Everything I gave you, and this is how you repay me. James stepped forward, placing a thick folder on the desk. Everything you gave him? You mean everything you stole. These are copies of every transfer, every contract, every deal you orchestrated. They're already in the hands of people who matter. The board, the press, the authorities. Walk away now, Victor. Or drown in the truth you tried to bury. For the first time, Victor's charm cracked. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. He looked at Amelia, fury blazing in his eyes. You'll regret this. Amelia's voice was calm, unwavering. No, Victor. The only regret here is yours, for thinking you could break my son, and for underestimating a mother's strength. The men behind Victor shifted, sensing the change in power. Victor realized then that his game was over. The Meridians might still circle, but without the company's wealth, without Daniel under his thumb, he had nothing left to offer them. He sneered, turned sharply on his heel, and stormed out. His shadow lingered, but his control was broken. When the door closed, the silence that followed felt like the first breath after drowning. Daniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "It's over," he whispered. "God, it's really over." Amelia knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "No, Daniel. This is just the beginning. You still have to face what you've done, the board, the employees, yourself. But you won't face it alone. Redemption isn't easy, but it's possible." He looked at her with tears in his eyes, his voice trembling. "After everything I did to you, why are you still here?" Her answer was simple, steady. "Because I'm your mother. And a mother doesn't stop loving, even when love hurts." The days that followed were not easy. Daniel stood before the board, ashamed but honest, admitting his failures. Some wanted him removed entirely. Others, swayed by Amelia's strength and Edward's safeguards, allowed him a second chance, but under strict watch. The company began to rebuild, slowly, carefully, guided now by Amelia's steady hand. At home, the bond between mother and son was fragile, tender, but growing. Daniel no longer looked at her with pride or defiance. He looked at her with respect and with the humility of a man who had seen how far he could fall. One evening, Amelia stood once more by the window of her bedroom, the rain tapping gently against the glass. She thought of Edward, of the lessons he had left behind, of the storm that had nearly torn her family apart. She whispered softly, as though speaking to him, "You were right, my love. Sometimes love means letting someone fall, but it also means being there when they're ready to rise again." The moral of her journey was clear. Love was not blind devotion, nor was it harsh abandonment. True love was the strength to let someone face the weight of their choices, and the courage to offer them a hand when they reached for it. Amelia turned from the window, her heart heavy but steady. The storm had passed, and though the skies might darken again someday, she knew now she could endure them. Because she had not only survived betrayal, she had found the power to turn it into redemption.